I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. So today is Father's Day. And it does feel that, like, every year it gets a little more difficult to talk about family stuff. And it seems to me part of that is because there just seems to be less and less happy family stuff around that people know about, express to each other. I mean, if anyone wants to get a measure of where we are as a society, I recently saw that a new subcategory on Netflix is suburban dysfunction. And so I think that that category is probably doing very well because people seem to resonate with that idea. In fact, I will say that that's one of those hot button issues that comes up these days a lot. A lot of different topics are very popular right now. Neurodivergence versus neurotypical is a big thing, but just in terms of families, dysfunctional family systems is one of those big things that I see discussed a lot right now. And I get it. I myself am a black sheep in a long line of black sheep in my family, so I'm not unfamiliar with dysfunctional family systems. And when I studied psychotherapy, I also found out, much to my dismay, that it's not the case that families either are or are not dysfunctional, but it's a spectrum, and every family has a little bit of dysfunction. And as I learned more about family systems, I also saw many ways that my own family participated in that cycle, let's say. But I think that with anything that becomes very popular, that comes into mainstream society and mainstream usage, is that it becomes the kind of thing that perhaps we apply too readily on a lot of situations. We look at something and go, dysfunction, dysfunction, dysfunction. And so many times when I've discussed the Buddha as a father, that's one of those things that gets touched on quite a bit. There's this tendency for us to look with our modern eyes at the Buddha and see something very similar to a deadbeat dad, let's say. And part of this is something that came up recently in a different discussion, and I was not the one leading to the discussion, but it was something that I heard. This idea that, the Buddha left his family. How possibly good of a father, a good of a husband, good of a son, whatever, if he had left, right? And we do have this tendency to look at family systems as we understand them now and apply them to then. I think it's important when we look at the Buddha's story, we not only maybe separate ourselves from our current views and opinions, our likes and dislikes, our prejudices and beliefs, but also pay very special attention to what the Buddha had to say about his own life. What I find very interesting is that when the Buddha recounts his own story of leaving his family to go be renunciant, he doesn't mention his wife or kid, but he does mention his own parents. And he talks about how his parents were crying as he was shaving off his own hair. Stories after the fact, sometimes centuries after the fact, people have added more details. The one that we often receive is him running off in the middle of the night, leaving his wife and sleeping child there. And sometimes the stories can become quite powerful. They really suck you in. You're just, it's the storytellers of those times were as good as storytellers now, They really create some images where you're like, wow. And one of those versions that we sometimes hear is that as the Buddha was leaving, as he was still Siddhartha and looking at his wife was sleeping with Siddhartha's son, and her arm was covering the son's face because he hadn't seen Rahula's face. And he didn't dare move his wife's arm because if he saw Rahula's face, he wouldn't have left. And you hear that kind of story and you're like, wow, that's really good storytelling. But it's not something that the Buddha says in his own words, at least as we have them in the Pali Canon and the suttas themselves, the discourses. We have other things that he does say about the very reasons why he left. And some of those are quite powerful. They bring up what we call in Buddhism samvega, that sense of fear and dismay that one has when they see the state of the world and they want to find some way out of the system that we're in. Some of the language is very, to me, powerful. It speaks a lot to the kind of mental state that he was in when he made that choice to leave. One of these comes out of the Sutta Nipata. And in this one, the Buddha starts out saying quite a few things, but he eventually gets to this one point where he says, seeing people floundering like fish in small puddles, competing with one another. As I looked at them, rather as I saw this, fear entered into me. The world was entirely without substance. All the directions were knocked out of line. Wanting a haven for myself, I saw nothing that wasn't laid claim to. Seeing nothing in the end but competition, I was filled with discontent. And so those are the words that we have. They're words of the Buddha, recorded words that he said about why he left. I hear those passages, those particular verses, commenting on the fear that he felt, the dismay that he felt, this discontent that he felt. And what I think about is, well, what if he had stayed in the life he was living with those feelings? Thinking on the kind of life he was living and the time he was living. You know, he wasn't a modern day suburban dad, let's say. You know, he couldn't find his way on his lunch break to a Barnes & Noble and look at the self-help section, you know. He couldn't listen to an audio book on how to regulate feelings of existential crisis, let's say. You know, he had really no way in the life he was living to find any reliable answers. That's the way he felt about it. Beyond that, we don't know what he was feeling, not in regard to his wife and not in regard to his son. It was pointed out to me recently, because I had never really noticed before, that in the suttas themselves, the Buddha's wife is never named. We have in the tradition her name, Yasodhara, but in the suttas themselves, she's not named. She's only ever referenced as Rahula's mother. So what the Buddha felt about his own marriage, whether it was a political marriage, some type of planned or arranged marriage, who's to say? But he, when he talks about his feelings, talks about fear and talks about discontent. I can't imagine what life he would have had if he had stayed in the life he was living without trying to find some kind of answer, some kind of path to live. I think about my own parents, which gets difficult to talk about because I don't want to in any way badmouth them, because they did a lot of good. But they were also teenagers when I was born. And that means that as teenagers, they hadn't even grown up enough to know who they were, and then they were in charge of shaping a life. Their brains hadn't even fully developed, and yet they were in charge of developing my brain. And so there's a lot of good and bad when I look and reflect back on my own childhood. In the Buddha's case, as a father, he was going through this existential crisis, this samvega. And he left for a number of years before he came back to his family. But by that point, he came to his family having figured out quite a bit. In this series of verses that I shared, I only shared a particular point where he's talking about that fear, where he's talking about that discontent. But shortly after that, he talks about how going on the path that he went on, he discovered here in the heart something that was hard to see, an arrow that was piercing the heart, one that he said that we all have, and this arrow causes us to run around in all kinds of directions. The idea being that it makes us run into various passions, various things that we do in search of relief because we're pierced in the heart. And he says that he saw this thing hard to see and he managed to pull it out. And so he was free from his passions. He was free of greed. He was free of aversion. He was free of delusion. He became the Buddha as we know him. He spent about a year figuring out the way his Sangha would work, ordaining his monks, creating his community. And then he did go back home, but on his terms as a monastic. He didn't go back to lay life, but he did visit with his father. He visited with his aunt, who was a stepmother. He visited with his wife, and he visited with his son. And out of that encounter, his son ended up going along with him as the first novice monk, which is a fun story that I won't recount here, but he ends up getting in a little trouble with the Buddha, gets in trouble with his own father for not having asked anyone any permission before he got his son ordained. Because by that point, it's interesting that the Buddha's father approaches him and says, hey, you should really ask the permission of the parents. And it's like, well, the Buddha's Rahula's son, Rahula's father, isn't he? But by that point, because he was living as a monastic, he wasn't really viewed as Rahula's father anymore. At that point, the Buddha's own father had been doing the raising, being the father figure. And Yasodhara, the Buddha's wife, was raising her son. But in any case, Rahula does become the first novice monk. And what we do see in the suttas is that the Buddha did care for his son, but he also just let him be a monk and learn lessons on his own terms. And when Rahula would make a mistake, the Buddha would come in with a particular lesson. One such example comes after what we assume must be a time that Rahula was caught telling lies, or perhaps playing tricks on other monks. The kind of thing that, got him in enough trouble that the Buddha found out and then went to go speak to him specifically. And I won't retell the entire story here because I've told it on different Father's Days. But the gist of the story is that the Buddha approaches and Rahula goes, oh great, my dad's coming. And he sets out a water basin to wash the Buddha's feet. And then there's a little water left in the dipper and the bowl and everything. And the Buddha uses that as a lesson to really drive home a particular point, which is that someone who can tell a deliberate lie is capable of all sorts of improper acts, all sorts of unskillful action. And so Rahula should really pay more attention to what he says and to be truthful and skillful in his speech. And then building off of that, he makes it a whole lesson about how one reflects on one's actions that have been done, actions that one is doing, and actions that one plans on doing, and how we reflect and look and evaluate and find out what's skillful. And it's a powerful lesson, and it's the kind of thing that I come back to time and time again, not only because, for starters, it's one of my own teacher's favorite stories that he references quite a lot, but even for myself, it's a profound lesson that, much like an onion, has so many layers. And as I continue to peel it back, I find so much more depth in the story, which is far more than just the Buddha telling Rahula not to tell lies, which is itself a very simple lesson. It's the kind of lesson you can find in a lot of places. It's the kind of lesson that if you read, Little House on the Prairie, you could probably find that lesson in there. But as you peel it back, you see the Buddha was taking Rahula very seriously, not just as his own son, but also as a monk, which is really quite amazing, because Rahula at the time of the story was maybe about 7 years old, 8 tops. And he was teaching him something that I think is connected to really important qualities for all of us to keep in mind, which are factors for becoming a stream enter. Stream entry is one of the first stages of awakening. There are 4 of them, and stream entry is the first one. Someone who becomes a stream enterer, their Dharma eye is open. They no longer have any doubts about the path. They have seen the deathless. They have not experienced it and had a chance to hold on to it, but they know it exists at this point because they've seen it. And someone who has done such a thing becomes part of the noble Sangha. Whether they're a lay or a monastic practitioner of the Buddha's path, they are considered part of the noble Sangha. And the Buddha was sharing with him the kind of things that help one cultivate and become such a person, become a stream enterer. When we look at these factors, typically we can look at 4 of them. And the first one is to associate with admirable people or people of integrity. And the second one is to listen to the true Dharma. The third one is to apply appropriate attention. And the fourth one is to practice the Dharma in alignment with the Dharma. And these four, in any discussion of them, they tend to be very interrelated. This is true of many aspects of the Buddha's path. When you look at them, you see that oftentimes it comes down to ethics. What are we thinking? What are we saying? What are we doing? And so even in these four factors for becoming a stream enterer, this is also the case. But there's also a way we might tier them and understand them, which is to say that admirable friendship, being the whole of the path, is really the big one there, and the other three follow from that. So associating with admirable or people or people of integrity is one of the things that the Buddha was bringing up in his lesson to Rahula. We think that the Buddha is just telling him, hey, don't tell any lies, but he's pointing out something very important to Rahula. You're a monk living with other monks. You're around people who are not just monks, they are arahants. They are fully enlightened people. These are noble and admirable people. And so it's not just enough to be around them. You should be emulating them and trying to be like them. And that's an aspect of associating with people of integrity. And I say this with no sense of hubris, more a sense of relief. That for a long time I felt like the kind of person who was not doing that. I was the example of the spoon in the soup. The spoon doesn't get to taste the soup no matter how long it's in the soup. And from a very young age, I was very, very spiritual, but spiritual mostly because I thought spirituality was really cool. It took a long time, I think, for me to mature through my teens and 20s to start actually applying the lessons I was surrounding myself with in such a way that I began to feel like a person of integrity. Which is why I say there's a sense of relief there, because I realized I finally got to a point in my life where I didn't pose a danger to myself. I was not harming myself. And I also got to a point where I wasn't harming others. And the Buddha says that one of the ways we harm people the most is by encouraging them to act in unskillful ways. So I am protecting myself by following precepts. And I'm also protecting others by encouraging people to follow precepts as well. We don't protect ourselves when we're not following precepts, we're just kind of living however we want. And we're not protecting others when we encourage them to do the same, to do other unskillful things. So that's one way that we associate with admirable people or people of integrity, is that not only do we find people to surround ourselves with who we really admire and that we want to be like, but then we actually make the effort to emulate them, to try to be like them. And then we can see how the other three follow from that. If we find people worthy of respecting, worthy of admiring, then it bears to actually listen to them, right? That's what it means to listen to the true Dharma, is that you're listening for lessons that actually do something about what you're feeling. Take the Buddha as an example. He was feeling this fear. He was feeling this discontent. I mean, I think of that image he points out of people, floundering around like fish in small puddles. That's a powerful image. He was feeling that way about his place in the world. He didn't see himself as separate from those fish. He knew he was one of them, and he didn't want to be one of them. And so he sought out admirable people, tried to learn from them as much as he could. And he realized that as he kept going, his standards kept getting higher and higher and higher until there wasn't anyone else for him to learn from. And so he had to learn from the Dhamma itself. And so that's what the Buddha's standards were. And so it was his turning of the Dhamma wheel again that set in motion the Buddha Sasana, the ability for us to follow the path we're following now, the Buddha's dispensation. And so we now have admirable examples that we can look to, noble standards that we can try to apply. And so listening to the Dhamma is part of that, taking it in and seeing what's actually going to relieve our stress, our suffering, and our pain. And so that gets us to appropriate attention, which again is a part of the Buddha's interaction with Rahula, talking about the mind as useful for constant reflection like a mirror or a pool. That we often should think about this path that we're living and not see it as just a little meditation technique we do to shave off a little stress, but to see it as a way of life that changes what we say, what we think, and what we do. And that has ripple effects, that we live interconnected to each other in a way that whatever good we're doing for ourselves has an impact on how we interact with others. And we end up living as an example to others, even in small ways. Even in just the act of following the path and struggling with the path ends up being an example to other people, which is really helpful. I'm happy to have examples like that in my own life. Well, throughout all these years of me being a Buddhist, I've had so many examples of people struggling with the path and succeeding in the path. But even the struggling has been helpful to see. People really putting in diligent effort on this path. That's worthwhile to look at and want to emulate. So we apply appropriate attention by really looking at what we're doing. And we hone those skills in meditation, it's true. But those skills extend beyond the cushion. We apply appropriate attention not just when we're focusing on the breath or focusing on the body, focusing on feelings or the mind, focusing on the Dhamma, but in how we talk to others, how we talk to ourselves, the way we act. Are we being generous? Are we being kind? Are we speaking in a way that is wholesome? These are the kind of things that we can do. And that brings us to practicing the Dhamma in alignment with the Dhamma, which to me is at this point a kind of motto, the kind of thing that I repeat to myself time and time again throughout the day, which is, again, taking the path away from the philosophical, which I'll admit might not be everyone else's issue, but it is one of mine. I have a very philosophical mind. I got degrees in Western philosophy. I can't help myself. I love to think abstract stuff. And what's been really helpful for me over several years now is to pare that all down and look at what I'm doing as a path of action. And so one of the ways I've had to think about this lesson, and it's one of the ways I'll encourage for you as well, is that sometimes we come to Buddhism and we want to shape the Dhamma to our own lives. We look at the Dhamma and go, well, this is neat, but I'm living a life this way, so I'm just going to take this little piece and put it here. I'm going to take that little piece and put it there. And it's one of the ways that I've discussed it with my own friends and family is essentially a buffet spirituality. You go along with your tray and you just grab the stuff that you like. Eventually I got to a point where I realized that that kind of living wasn't really helping me because it led to a lot of inconsistency in my practice, inconsistency in how I was developing my mind, inconsistency in how I was developing in terms of skillfulness. I realized that it wasn't so much the case that I needed to change the Dharma, but that I needed to change my life to live in accordance with the Dharma, to take it very seriously, the kind of lifestyle that I was seeing in people I admired, and making my life more like theirs. And at first, I've talked about this before, for a lot of us there's that sense of FOMO, especially when you live in LA and there's a lot of different activities and fun things going on. It can get really tedious really quick to feel like you're always turning down invitations to things. But the kind of life that I live now, in its quiet and its stillness, gives me a lot of time to develop the qualities that are really making an impact on my life, the kind of person that I'm being. To say that I can now trust myself as a person of integrity is something that I want to really hold on to. We often in Buddhism talk about how we're always casting off identities and casting off senses of self. But sometimes some aspects of self are part of the path. And being a person of integrity is one of those things that we can really hold on to and be secure in and feel good about developing. And so that's one of the things that I like to do. And I use that phrase, practicing the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, as my motto, as my, I don't know what you would call it. In Greek, I guess it'd be like a maxim, and that's how I approach it now. And so to bring it back to the story of the Buddha, when he was interacting with Rahula, by talking to him this way, he was doing something that I wish I had around 7, 8 years old, which is someone talking to you not only as a child whose mind needs to be shaped, but as a human being going through a lot of the same existential things that everyone else goes through. And so the Buddha was not just giving a lesson on the sort of mundane aspects of just being an upright person and telling the truth, but he was pointing Rahula down the path towards stream entry and eventual arahantship. And so in that way, that's how the Buddha approached all of his monks and all of the lay students who came to him as well. I like to think of the Buddha not only as a father to Rahula, but through his example as an admirable friend and as a teacher, as someone who set the Dhamma wheel in motion. He's a father to all of us. In that sense, he is the best admirable friend we will ever come across. We have his teachings recorded. We have his teachings being shared with us every day, available to us here and now to put into practice. And so, if that's my message for Father's Day, I hope it resonates with you in some way, to think of the Buddha as a father, to think of his lessons as a way of life that you can apply here, right now. Yeah, that's it. That's all I got. Thank you.